Okay, hi everybody. My name's Gilbert Martinez. As you know, I'm the chapter commissioner for the Rogers Hornsby chapter of SABR. Very excited to introduce our guest speaker today in celebration of SABR Day. SABR Day going on today and other days as well, but this is how our chapter is celebrating SABR Day. We mostly, as many of you know, we mostly meet in person over 200 months in a row. We've met in person. We have our big winter meeting in January. We also go to baseball games at the Dell Diamond to see the Round Rock Express, and also down to Wolf Stadium to see the San Antonio Missions. So we've done a variety of things, but we often get together for lunch to talk baseball all through the year. So a very active chapter, but I recognize most everybody that's with us today. I'm glad you could join us. We are recording this for others who want to watch this later, or I'm expecting a terrific discussion and presentation with Keith O'Brien, so that we may want to relive this whole thing as well. But let me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and then also let you know that his website is simply Keith O'Brien, KeithOB.com. And so you can see this is the cover page on his website now. He's written a book called Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. This is a book that is going to be published next month. And so on his website, you can see as I'm scrolling, there are different places you can purchase the book. There's also an opportunity to purchase a signed copy as well. There's also a review already posted on Kirkus Reviews. And then here is Keith O'Brien himself. He's in one of the boxes, as you can see, but he is a veteran reporter. He's also written several books. Others are listed here very quickly. One called Paradise Fall, The True Story of Environmental Catastrophe. And then also another book called Fly Girls, How Five Daring Women Defied All Odds and Made Aviation History. And of course, today, what we're most interested in, they all sound very interesting, but of course, we are particularly interested in hearing more about Pete Rose. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Keith O'Brien. And if I could just, it looks like everybody else is muted, so that's good. Please stay muted, and then we'll turn it over to Keith, and then I think hopefully we'll have some question and answer time toward the end. Please, Keith, take it away.
Gilbert, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your Saturday to be here today. Always great to talk about baseball and the history of baseball with people who care about it like I do. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Like Gilbert just said, the book Charlie Hustle is out. It's out on March 26th. It is available for pre-order now. You can pre-order it, as Gilbert just said. It'll arrive by magic, by mail on the day of publication. It's amazing what they can do. And you know, I think what I'd love to do with our time here today, because we all know the story of Pete Rose to a certain extent, and we probably all have opinions about Pete already. Is, you know, I'd love to give you a little bit of background on the story, sort of take you behind the curtain into this story and my reporting of the story for 15 minutes or so. And then I'd really just love to open it up for a robust discussion about Pete, his legacy, complicated as it is. So, you know, I think where I'd love to start is just with a few questions. You know, why Pete? Why now? Why this book? And how did I do it? So let's start with why Pete. Because again, we know a lot about him. But the fact is that Pete has lived for so long and become, in the last 35 years in particular, a caricature of himself in many ways, that we have forgotten who he really is, or who he used to be, and why we cared about him in the first place. You know, this was a man who we only care about his fall because we cared about his rise. And so one thing I wanted to do with this book is reconstruct that, you know, bring us back to that time when we cared and why we loved him, you know, bring him to the mountaintop and then let him fall as he does. And And when you do that, and when you go back and you look at him through the prism of history, as I did, a few things are very, very clear. The first is, you simply cannot tell the history of baseball in America in the 20th century without Pete Rose. You cannot do it. From 1963 to 1989, he is one of the most polarizing, exciting, controversial, loved, beloved, hated players in baseball. And he often finds himself right in the middle of the most historic moments in that time. I mean, the examples, are many. All right, you've got the epic 1970 All-Star game in Cincinnati, which ends in extra innings when he barrels into Ray Fosse and changes Ray Fosse's career forever. You've got the many World Series that his teams reached in the 1970s and 80s with the Phillies and the Reds. Those Cincinnati World Series in particular were crucial to the history of baseball. I mean, he's there in 1970 when the Orioles win. He's there in 1972 when the upstart Oakland A's win. Of course, many of us will remember the 1973 playoffs when the Reds lose to another upstart, the New York Mets, and that lightning rod moment with Pete Rose fighting with Bud Harrelson out at second base. And then, of course, there are those epic World Series. 1975, which I think, we could debate as baseball fans for a long time, but I think all of us would probably put the 1975 World Series in our top 3 most, dramatic, best World Series. And then, because the 1975 World Series was so dramatic and so remembered and such a great story and many stories within the story, we've forgotten the 1976 Big Red Machine, which arguably was one of the greatest baseball teams ever assembled, a team that doesn't even lose a single playoff game, that absolutely steamrolls through the playoffs. And then there's Pete Rose in 1978, making the last great assault on Joe DiMaggio's, hallowed hit streak record. So all of these things happen in a span of time, a short span of time, which is why the Sporting News would name Pete Rose the player of the decade of the 1970s. It wasn't even close. Again, we've forgotten such things. And then, of course, we all remember, Pete's hit record 1985. But we probably have forgotten some of the details of that. If you were alive then, you'll remember that the world stopped that night, that every network cut into regularly scheduled programming to carry the moment live, that the game stopped in Cincinnati for 7 minutes, a standing ovation that lasts 7 minutes, so long that the San Diego Padres on the field leave the field or sit down on the field like little leaguers because it just won't end, And the amazing thing is, despite all those things I just said, it wasn't even about the hits or the moments or the World Series titles. Those weren't even the reasons why people loved him in the first place. People loved Pete Rose because of how hard he played. And, again, it's hard to put it in context, but because, this Charlie Hustle vibe has been sort of mythologized a little bit by a white working class, all male press that, saw a lot of themselves in Pete, right? I mean, this is the time when women weren't allowed in the locker room, female reporters weren't in the locker room, and there was not a single major sports columnist of color in the country. They were all white working class men writing about a great white working class guy. They loved him, right? But that myth of Pete playing hard was real. I mean, they thought he was insane in the 1960s at a time when we think players were playing hard, right? This was a moment when players didn't have a 5-year deal or a 3-year deal or a 2-year deal. Every single player was playing for the next year's deal. even Mickey Mantle, even Willie Mays, even Roberto Clemente, they were on one-year deals. So everybody's playing hard, and they thought Pete was insane, stupidly insane for how hard he played. We wouldn't even know what to do with a player like Pete Rose if he was playing on a major league team today. No one would even know what to do with him. So we love him for all of these reasons. And then he self-destructs, and I think that is the best way to put it, even though Pete himself wouldn't say that. Pete self-destructs for the same reason why he ever succeeded on the field. He believed on the field that he would always win, that he would always prevail, that he could do anything. And this is why he became so successful. And yet he felt the same way about himself off the field, which is why he unraveled in such a spectacular way. He believed he could do anything. So this, to me, is effectively a Greek tragedy that just happens to play out on an American baseball diamond in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Why write that story now? Well, I'd say there are two reasons. One, I believe, to use a sports term, that we are all day to day. You know that term they always say when someone's got an injury. We're all day to day, right? We don't know what's happening tomorrow. But when you're 83 years old, as Pete is about to be, you are really day to day. And so are all the other people who knew him best in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so I felt it important to go find as many of those people as possible and speak to them before it was too late. And so I'm talking about people Pete Rose played against. I'm talking about his former teammates. I'm talking about John Dowd and the investigators who tracked down and unraveled Pete's lies in 1989. I'm talking about two former commissioners of baseball, three different men who placed Pete Rose's bets on baseball, his ex-wives, his ex-mistresses, his children, and of course, Pete Rose himself. I interviewed all of them. And I did interview Pete Rose for 27 hours of on-the-record interviews before he stopped calling me back, before he shut down, which he did ultimately. So time was short. It's important to reckon with the past while we have a chance to reckon with the people who lived that past. Two, why now? Well, I would submit that the world has changed in fantastic, unexpected ways since 1989, and in particular in the last 6 years, with the sweeping legalization of sports gambling in most states. Leagues, including Major League Baseball, are now begging for us to bet on their games, in ways that no one could have foreseen 10 years ago, much less 35 years ago. And I want to be clear, I don't think this in any way forgives Pete or diminishes his poor choices. I don't argue that at all. I'm just saying the world has changed. We think about gambling in different ways now than we did just a few years ago. What better time to revisit the story of one of our most notorious gamblers than right now? So, that's why Pete, that's why now. And then, I've really tried to tell this story in a different way. There have been, many things written about Pete Rose, of course, but by and large, you can put those things into two different buckets. There were a couple of books that were written about Pete Rose in the 1990s, right after the scandal, right after the banishment. And I want to be clear, they're good books. I read them. They're helpful to my research. However, because they were written so close to the scandal, every line, every word, every choice in those books is negative about Pete, which is fair. There's a lot to be negative about, but that's just one lens. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there have been no fewer than a half dozen books written by Pete Rose about Pete Rose since 1970, or at least by writers he hired. And of course, as you can imagine or might know if you picked up one of those books are very self-serving. So on the one end of the spectrum, you have these negative books. On the other end of the spectrum, you have these very self-serving books. And what I really wanted to do here was look at Pete Rose's story through the prism of history with granular reporting and those interviews that I mentioned, and then write that story and let people come to their own conclusions here. You know, one thing I learned long ago as a journalist, and I think this is helpful advice to anyone who's pursuing their own research or pursuing their own writing, is that you never want to tell a reader how to feel. Don't tell people how to feel. Show them the story, and people can decide. Your readers are smart. They know, they're thinking. You know, if they've made it to page 70 of your book or page 270 of your book, they're in and they're thinking about it. So, you know, what I really try to do here is just tell Pete Rose's story, that rise and fall, framed against the backdrop of a time where everything changes in baseball, right? From 1960, his first year in the minor leagues, to 1989, the day he's banished, everything changes in baseball. Everything. It goes from this unpolished national pastime with lots of shady characters doing business in the shadows, you know, covered by a press corps that was all male and all white, to a very diverse league with a very diverse press corps, covering $1 billion sport. You know, in 1989, just months before Pete is banished, Major League Baseball signs its first $1 billion television contract. You know, in 1989, for the first time, fans across the country could watch baseball games, nationally televised baseball games, 5 or 6 nights a week. You know, this was now big business. Everybody was making money now, the players them included, you know, thanks to the free agency that they had fought for, in particular, Curt Flood. And this entire world has changed. This entire ecosystem has changed, but Pete Rose doesn't see it. Pete Rose is still the same as he was, you know, 25 years earlier. He still thinks he can do the same things. So that's the story I've tried to tell here. And, you know, I want to answer in conclusion the question that I'm sure is the first one on everyone's minds. You know, that late night sports bar argument that we probably all had about something, if not in particular about Pete Rose. Should he be in the Hall of Fame? And I guess I want to say about that is a couple things. First, you know, I'm not gonna fight Pete's battles for him here. This is a man who has made many poor choices over the course of his adult life, and I believe that he needs to live with those choices. And I also believe that while it's a fun late night sports bar argument, it is a hypothetical argument built on a mountain of hypotheticals. Pete Rose is not on the ballot at Cooperstown. He's not going to be on the ballot at Cooperstown. I believe all evidence suggests that at least while he is alive, Pete Rose is not even sniffing Cooperstown. And so this is just one hypothetical upon another. To me, the more interesting conversation and the far more nuanced and complicated conversation, and in fact, more relevant conversation, is about how we celebrate athletes, period. You know, are we celebrating them for the lives that they've lived, for the people they are, for the choices that they've made, or are we celebrating them for their art, their craft, the art that they displayed on the field? Is it about life? Is it about art? And this actually was a calculation and an equation that was identified by Bart Giamatti himself, the commissioner of baseball in 1989, on the day that Pete was banned from baseball. That day, August 24th, 1989, there's a massive press conference in New York at the New York Hilton. Hundreds of reporters are there. to hear Bart Giamatti ban Pete from baseball. And, you know, you can go, by the way, and see almost all of this press conference on YouTube. And it's a stunning thing. It is really sort of a masterclass in crisis management, and one that you can hardly imagine today. You know, Bart Giamatti comes out, flanked by John Dowd and Faye Vincent, and he gives a very brief and almost poetic statement that lasts about 3 minutes, and then he opens it up to Q&A. And he takes questions from the media for almost an hour. I mean, can you imagine today a commissioner of any league taking questions from 200 media members for almost an hour? By the way, on live television, carried live on CNN, ESPN, every network? No way. It would never happen. And Giamatti does it. And it is truly amazing. And one of the questions he's asked that day during Q&A was this. A reporter asks him, what are we to do with Pete Rose and the Hall of Fame? Because what's forgotten by most baseball fans, and even by me, I'll be honest, before I started this research, was that in 1989, when Pete was banned from baseball, he was still eligible for the Hall of Fame. There was no rule that barred permanently ineligible players from being elected to the Hall of Fame. Indeed, when Pete signs the document agreeing to his banishment, he believes that his name will appear on the ballot in December 1991, 5 years after his last at bat as a player. And so the reporter asked Giamatti, what do we do about this? And Giamatti says, and it's amazing, Giamatti says that they will have every opportunity to vote on Pete as they did every other player, that he would do nothing to influence their vote as he would on any other player. And then Giamatti says that he looked forward to seeing how the writers judged life and art. And I can tell you, historically, it was always the latter. You know, 2 days ago, February 2nd, 1936, the first class was voted into the Hall of Fame. February 2nd, 1936. 5 guys. It was Ty Cobb with the most votes. Babe Ruth was second. Honus Wagner, Christy Mathewson, Walter Johnson. First class. Not a single drop of ink was spilled in the newspapers debating their worth as men or their worth as moral figures. And by the way, this would be the practice for the next 50 years. It really wasn't until the 1980s when people started to debate, is this guy a good person? You know, should we vote Ferguson Jenkins into the Hall of Fame? He had those drug problems. You know, should we vote Dave Parker into the Hall of Fame? He had those drug problems. Should we vote Jim Rice into the Hall of Fame? He wasn't very nice to reporters. These questions only happen much later. For the longest amount of time, it is about the art. And, you know, I'm not going to say here that it should strictly be that. I'll be honest, I don't really know the answer. But I will say this. If the qualifications to make it into our athletic halls of fame, be it Cooperstown or Canton or Springfield or anywhere else, if the qualifications to make it into these athletic halls of fame are being good people, moral figures, I think we're going to have empty halls of fame. Really, really empty halls of fame. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions y'all might have about Pete, about the research, about the book, about the writing, anything you want.
Terrific. Keith, thank you so much for that tremendous overview about Pete Rose. And I see Jan has raised his hand. I've got a couple of quick questions, and I see Wayne has raised his virtual hand as well. We'll definitely get to them. But Keith, let me ask you real quick, because I know Joe Morgan passed away in 2020, and Joe Morgan has a connection, you know, to Texas because he came up with the Astros. And of course, I know you're from Cincinnati, so he also played for the Reds, and of course, the Big Red Machine. Did you get a chance to interview him or draw on anything? I just, and tell us a little bit about how, like, your time period of doing research for this book.
Yeah, great question. So to answer the easy question first, unfortunately, no, I didn't get a chance to interview Joe Morgan. I began my research on this book in the summer of 2021. So, he had passed. I will say, Morgan did write what was, a pretty revealing biography, a memoir rather of himself, that came out in the 90s, which is very helpful. He wasn't one to sugarcoat things, or to dodge some hard truths. So his memoir was certainly helpful. Also helpful from Morgan's point of view was, just the interviews that he gave over the years, that you can find in newspapers, magazines, elsewhere. To me, so that's to answer your question. Morgan is absolutely critical to the book and is absolutely part of the story, because one thing that I found in my research and writing the book is, despite all those things I said about Pete and all those amazing moments he's a part of, he really has miraculous luck, Pete does, for the early part of his career. Remember, the Reds make the World Series in 70, but they get dismantled by the Orioles. And it's really only after they trade for Morgan that things start to click in. And, Morgan was crucial to the success of the team and protecting Pete as a hitter. Pitchers pitched to Pete because Morgan was there too, followed by Perez and bench. Oh my God, how do we get around this, right? And what's really interesting to me about Morgan is this. His reputation with the Astros was as a, quote, troublemaker, which was a label, just to put it bluntly, was often assigned to outspoken Black players in the 1960s and 70s. And so Sparky Anderson is actually hesitant about trading for Morgan because he's worried about the troublemaker label. And in fact, Sparky spins it a little bit in his favor in his own memoirs by saying that he assigned Joe Morgan a locker next to Pete Rose so that Morgan could learn the right way to play baseball and the right way to be a leader. So it's just historic levels of irony that when the press and Sparky Anderson are worried about Joe Morgan and his troublemaking attitude, Pete Rose is already betting with bookies on football and basketball and sleeping his way, according to my reporting, all the way across the country, and so, it is very telling to me that, Morgan was sort of, cast as this troublemaker when the guy whose locker he was assigned to sit next to was creating far more problems than he was, and nobody was talking about it.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith. Let's get to questions from others. Jan, please go ahead.
I was wondering if you had a definitive source for Pete Rose acquiring the name Charlie Hustle. I'd heard possibly an apocryphal account involving Mickey Mantle, but I don't know if that's true or not. I wonder if you happen to know where that name was hung on him.
Great question. Yes, I do, and I'll share that story with you. But I will say there's still parts of it that I do think might be a little apocryphal. So if you go, and it's a great question because I really did want to identify this. And so, he clearly obtains the nickname in March 1963, spring training 1963. He's fighting for a job with the big club. He's had an amazing year the prior year with the Macon Peaches at what was effectively AA. And he is, trying to pass Don Blasingame to be the starting second baseman for the Cincinnati Reds. And a couple of other young players like Tommy Helms. He's trying to beat them. And reporters begin to use the word hustle to describe Pete Rose. This starts to work its way into, in particular, the column of a Cincinnati Post beat writer named Earl Lawson. All the players called him Scoops. Scoops Lawson starts to use the word hustle to describe Pete. And then on March 18th, I believe it was, 1963, the New York Yankees come to Al Lopez Field to play the Reds in a spring training game. You know, spring training games back then, you know, weren't as big of a deal. They didn't draw big crowds, but the Yankees were huge at the time. This was peak Yankees, as we all know. And, you know, it's the Mantle Yankees. It's the big swinging, you know, end of sort of peak prime years Mickey Mantle. And it's a sellout at Al Lopez Field. They're literally, no joke, there are photographs of it in the Tampa papers. People have scaled the light posts in the outfield to get a better view of the game. Again, going back to the unpolished nature of baseball in the 1960s. And the game, in an unusual news, is being carried live on television, both in New York and in Cincinnati. Again, didn't happen with spring training games in the 1960s. And Pete Rose starts the game. He plays the entire game at second base. And he has sort of what was at the time a classic Pete Rose kind of game. You know, he struggles a little bit defensively in the field that game, but he breaks up a couple of double plays, sliding hard into second. And then, you know, at some point in that game, in the mid to late innings, he lays down a bunt. And according to the papers, in the days that followed, Mantle found it absurd. He found it absurd that anybody would be laying down a bunt in a spring training game in the 6th or 7th inning. And he laughed about it with Whitey Ford on the steps of the field at Al Lopez ballpark. And that is when they came up with the name Charlie Hustle. However, it's unclear if that was the exact term. You know, in the days that follow, there are a few different terms that are used. They call the papers say it was Charlie Hustler. They also say it was Henry Hustle. And finally, the papers seem to sort of settle on the story of Charlie Hustle. And Pete, because Pete loved and still loves being the center of attention, he played it up. You know, it's clear from what Mickey Mantle would say later, and I mean years later, the term was intended as an insult. They thought Whitey Ford and Pete and Mickey Mantle thought this guy, Pete Rose, was playing too hard. They found it absurd and ridiculous and thought he was playing too hard. But Pete, you know, spins it his own way and keeps telling reporters all summer, Mickey Mantle gave me that name. He called me Charlie Hustle. He called me Charlie Hustle. And he really builds up the myth around it, and the press runs with it from there.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, great question.
Boy, Keith, there could not be a better title to your book than Charlie Hustle and the Polarizing Nature and how he took it as a compliment and spun it in a self-serving way. No, it's not an insult at all. It's a compliment. Look. And then like the old timers are laughing at him. And boy, does that foreshadow so much.
So much. And I mean, I'm going to use a phrase that Mickey Mantle would use later. It actually appears in his own memoir, The Mick. You know, he said that he would sooner wear a dress than lay down a bunt, you know, in a spring training game. That's how he felt about it.
Wow. All right. Thank you, Keith. Let's get to these other questions. Wayne, Peter, and then Brian. Wayne, please go ahead.
Thanks, Gilbert. I'm in Baltimore, and I'm wearing my St. Louis Browns Satchel Paige jersey, by the way.
Love it.
And I'm kicking around the different SABR Zooms today. Joe Poznansky at the New York group this morning talked a little bit about the Bart Giamatti, Pete Rose incident, and he said that Giamatti, the last thing he wanted to do was suspend Rose for life. He loved the way he played, everything, loved him as a player, his history, and that he proposed to Rose, look, I'll suspend you for a year, even though the rules may very well have called for a lifetime ban, but I'll suspend you for a year if you just admit that you bet, and you bet on baseball, you bet on the Reds. Just admit that. We'll suspend you for a year, and you come back, and then, you know, the Hall of Fame won't even be a question or any of that. What did your reporting turn up about that offer, that supposed offer?
Well, I'll go one step further than that. Based on my reporting, let me just go back for a second. the original tip about Pete Rose's gambling comes into Peter Uberoth's office sometime around mid-February 1989. And I want to be clear about something here, and this is also part of my book. Baseball had known for at least a decade that Pete was engaging in behavior with bookies and gamblers that was reckless. And they had overlooked a lot of it. And at least once they had buried it, going back to the late 1970s. So baseball is well aware that Pete Rose is in general a problem. They also know that he's hanging out with guys in Cincinnati that they would call unsavory. So they're aware of all these things. They're not taking action. Bart Giamatti at this time is still the president of the National League. However, he is the commissioner in waiting, and Peter Uberoth has one foot out the door. When the tip comes in that Sports Illustrated has received an anonymous tip and is beginning to investigate that Pete Rose has bet on baseball and has bet on the Reds. So Uberoth, Giamatti, and Vincent invite Pete to come to New York secretly, February 19th, I believe, 1989, to have a conversation about this. And I spoke with multiple people who were there that day. Obviously, can't interview Giamatti, unfortunately. And what's clear is this. If Rose had come in at that time and fallen on the sword and said what I believe to be true, which is, yes, I've been betting on baseball and I really have a problem, baseball would have done everything it could to help Pete Rose. Uberoth, in particular, did not want to saddle Bart Giamatti with this scandal. Uberoth really wanted it to be over quickly. They were passing the torch on April 1st, 1989. The meeting with Rose, February 19th, 1989. Uberoth, I'm not going to say he wants it to go away, but I believe, based on my reporting, that Uberoth wanted to handle it the way he had handled the cocaine crisis a few years earlier. As many of us will recall, as baseball fans and historian, many ball players, big names, Keith Hernandez, Dave Parker, others get wrapped up in this cocaine scandal centralized out of Pittsburgh in the early 1980s when Uberoth is commissioner. Not a single one of them was suspended or banned or anything. Uberoth struck a deal where they all essentially admitted what they did, gave a portion of their salaries the following year to drug counseling programs, and poof, problem solved. I believe that if Rose comes in and is honest with those men in that room, Uberoth, Giamatti, Vincent, he's honest with them, they would have found him help. They would have gotten him what he needed. They would have frankly rehabilitated him because the scandal was bad for the game. It was bad for baseball. It was bad for the handoff of power between Uberoth and Giamatti. And frankly, you know, Rose was beloved. And you know, again, we've all sort of forgotten through the passage of time, but back in 1989, because Pete was still lying about what he really did, he had people divided over the truth. You know, most people by end of the summer of 1989 believes that Rose was lying, but a good portion of people, and I'm talking about 40% of baseball fans, still believed Rose. And so absolutely, yes, if they could have struck a deal to get him help, they would have. And I do believe, as Joe said, that Pete would have been back in baseball in some capacity in a short matter of time, whether that's 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. None of us will ever know, but I do believe the problem would have been solved.
And he refused and sued, and that's very fascinating. Thank you, Keith.
Yeah, you bet. Great question.
Let's hear from Peter next. Go ahead, Peter.
I really appreciate this talk, Keith. It's wonderful. I read Don Zimmer's autobiography a few years ago, and he talked about when these players went to spring training, especially the young ones like Pete Rose, that there wasn't really much to do when games weren't being played, and that the veterans like himself would take the younger players to the not the pony, the dog racing tracks. And he said Pete Rose was an individual who went to those dog racing tracks. Not that he was an apologist for what was going on later on with Pete Rose, but he said, a lot of the responsibility falls on baseball right from the beginning of these young guys' careers. I was wondering if you did any type of research into, where these, this form of addiction or just gambling down in Florida. I mean, there's the tracks are there.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so the scene at the dog track and the horse track in the Tampa area was epic. Anybody who was anybody in baseball, would try to get there. The dog track was easier because the races were at night. And as we all remember, you used to play all the spring training games in the afternoon. But sometimes they'd be done by 3:30, and you could still jump over, to the horse track there across the bay and hit the horse track for a couple of hours and then jump down to the dog track. And the guys used to call it the double header. They would do the horse track and then they'd do the dog track. And it was a scene, the stars, the big stars at the time at the dog track would have their private tables. Pete Rose wouldn't have had that in the early 1960s. He would have floated around. Interestingly, Pete liked to do what he called triple headers. Pete, whenever possible, would like to go to the horse track, then the dog track, then late night highlight. And so he would go all day and all night. And so, yeah, it was a part of the culture at spring training, undoubtedly. And what's also clear in part of my book is it was just also part of Pete's family culture. His father, who Pete lionized his father. And his father basically loved three things. His father loved to play sports himself. He was a semi-pro athlete in Cincinnati. He loved to watch his kids play baseball, especially his oldest son, Pete. And he loved to go to the racetrack in Cincinnati. It was called River Downs. And, some of Pete's fondest memories as a boy, and we can all do our own sort of dime store psychiatry here, but some of Pete's favorite memories as a boy was not playing Legion ball on the West Side, was not playing baseball at Western Hills High School, but those Saturdays and Sundays when there was no baseball and they could all pile into the car and drive across town to River Downs where he'd stand on the rail and cheer for his daddy's horse. And I do think there is something to all of that. But back to your question about culture, and again, about complicity of our culture. It's sort of a stunning thing to reveal. But in 1979, Pete's now, with the Phillies. The season has ended. The Phillies have had a very disappointing year. Pete was paid a big sum of money to come in and win. They don't in 1979. And the playoffs are going on. And we all might remember there was a prominent show, on CBS on Sundays before the football games with Brent Musburger and all those guys. And one of the guys on that show was Jimmy the Greek. Jimmy the Greek, the bookmaker, right? In October 1979, Jimmy the Greek suffers an injury in a motorcycle accident. Who do they call that Sunday to come in and do the breakdown on all the games and who to pick and who not to pick? Pete Rose. Why, I would submit, would CBS or anyone think that Pete Rose might be a good replacement for Jimmy the Greek on a Sunday in October? There's only one reason. Everybody knew he gambled. And there's one moment in the show, which I have viewed in its entirety, where Pete is breaking down the games at the board, right? Back when the board was these little things you'd slide in. And he's breaking down, I think it was a game between the Buccaneers and the Giants or something like that. And the Buccaneers were road favorites against the Giants. And Pete points out this detail, that the Buccaneers were road favorites against the Giants, and he was picking them anyway. And he says it's the first time in the history of the Buccaneers that they've ever been road favorites. And Musburger stops and looks at him and he says, wow, that is a really interesting nugget. How do you know all this stuff? And Pete goes, I watch football pretty good. His words. I would have said pretty well, but I'm going to use his quote. Pretty good.
Yes. Now, Keith, I know we're right up against it. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah. I can go to about 2:55. We got about 8 minutes.
Okay. Please, Brian, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, you've sort of first of all, the great talk. Thank you. You've kind of touched on this question a few different places, but you know, we just got a book here in the house, Jay Jaffe, trying to equalize, you know, very objectively the numbers and across eras about who should and shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. And through this, you know, that's the numeric part of this. And, you know, if it was just numbers alone, like you said, it would be a no-brainer for Pete Rose. But given your research here, has this given you a way of thinking about the non-numeric? You kind of talked about eras, and we used to not care about a lot of these things. But more broadly speaking, so we've got this thing with Pete Rose, Barry Bonds, and Roger Clemens. Like there's some things that, you know, affect your results. You know, a lot of people would argue Clemens and Bonds would be in anyway. They should have stayed clean and they would have gotten in anyhow. And anyway, I like, more broadly speaking, all of these character flaws or the missteps or bad decisions, how to, like, an objective rubric to think about these things, because we have it with the numbers. We don't have it with the kind of the missteps.
Yeah. So yeah, I've thought a lot about it. I want to be clear. You know, there are probably people in this call right now who are a lot better statisticians or a lot better at sabermetrics than I am. I don't proclaim to be an expert in those things at all. But of course, I've thought a lot about it. And, you know, I guess one of the confounding things, and one of the reasons why it's fun to talk about, is there is no objective rubric, and likely will never be an objective rubric. And frankly, that's probably good for every Hall of Fame, because it leads to discussions, which makes, you know, baseball relevant and makes the Hall of Fame relevant. But yeah, I do think there are many examples of people who have been sandbagged by their off-field problems that probably should be in the Hall of Fame. I'm going to go back to one I already mentioned, Dave Parker. You know, again, you guys could probably, you know, refute this or have sabermetrics or analysis that I don't have. But just objectively speaking, as a fan, and just when you look at the numbers, if Todd Helton is in the Hall of Fame, and I know that I see there's a Rockies fan here on the call, well then, by God, Dave Parker's got to be in the Hall of Fame. And then if you just even want to compare Parker to someone of his own generation, you know, when you get off the call, go look at Dave Parker's numbers versus Andre Dawson's numbers. They're very similar, very similar. And I do believe that Parker was hurt by the fact that he was branded with the cocaine scandal. I do not think it helped that he was a black man who was outspoken and sort of flashy. You know, he was unapologetic. I don't think that helped him in the 1980s and 90s when he was being voted upon. So I think that's one. Two, you know, and again, we go down this rabbit hole, we'll be here all day, the steroids discussion. And probably like all of you, I've gone circles on this one. You know, I used to be a purist, and I used to think, all right, listen, they used it. They for me anyway, they tainted the game. They gutted the numbers. They made the numbers meaningless. They stole records from guys who probably deserve them more. All of that drives me crazy. But I do think at this point, it is a little absurd that the best players of an era are not in, when frankly, there are already guys in the Hall of Fame who did steroids. And I have this on good record from sources who know. Sources have told me there are guys in the Hall of Fame who have done steroids, and there are guys who are not in the Hall of Fame who we think have done steroids but didn't. And when you start going into that kind of conversation, I think the only way around it is something that Terry Francona once told me, which is put it on the plaque. You know, vote them in if you think they deserve it, and then put it on the plaque. By that, I mean, you'd enshrine Barry Bonds, but include on the plaque that he was, you know, enmeshed in this massive performance-enhancing drug scandal. But here's the problem, and here's why I don't think it's going to happen. You know, if any of you have been to Cooperstown in July when they do these, you know, induction days, it's like enshrining gods now. You know, 100,000 people come to the ceremonies. The guys themselves give speeches that last 35 minutes, you know, praising themselves. This never happened before. You know, Ted Williams, when he was inducted in 1966, spoke for 6 minutes, and he wrote the speech the night before in his hotel room. And the crowd that day was, I don't know, 8,000 people. You know, it's too big. And if you're gonna turn them into minor gods and celebrate them as minor gods, well, you can't have guys there who were maybe cheating or maybe bending the rules. You can't do it. It's because you can't celebrate those kind of people. That's the conundrum, I think.
Keith, let's just get one more question if we could. Linda, this will be the last one. Please,
Great.
Linda.
Sounds good.
Okay, Linda, you got to unmute yourself.
Actually, you kind of answered my questions with that just now. So I want to say thank you. I have very strong feelings about Pete Rose, and they're mostly negative, but I will read your book because I have an open mind and I will see what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I just want to say thank you so much for the conversation. I loved all the questions. Loved joining your group. I love that you guys meet and have lunch together. Man, that's so cool. I wish I lived in the Austin area so I could join you for lunch. But really, really fun conversation. And I want to say, you know, if anybody is interested in the book and you do pre-order the book, please send me an email with your receipt or your address or whatever, and I will send you a signed book plate so you can put it in your book. I also have I've got some Charlie Hustle bookmarks here that I can mail to you. And you can read all your future books, baseball or otherwise, with your very own Charlie Hustle bookmark, which will be ironic in lots of ways because I'm not sure Pete has read a lot of books, which isn't a dig against him. He just admits it. He says he's only read the books about him. But you can read all your books with Pete Rose.
Thank you so much. I echo Linda, and I'm sure everybody on the call. We're so grateful that you joined us today to celebrate SABR Day. You're clearly one of us. We really feel like, you know, you've done Pete justice, and maybe that's saying a lot, you know, considering what a polarizing character he is, the person he's become. But I really appreciate your journalistic approach to kind of trying to tell the fuller story. And, you know, that's high praise coming from Linda. She does have an open mind and, you know, she wants to approach it. So, you know, you have an open invitation. You know, we get together every month. If you're ever in Austin, maybe for a book tour or anything at all, please reach out, let me know. We can adjust our meeting schedule to try to accommodate yours if you happen to be in Austin or Central Texas. But it certainly has been terrific having you today. Thanks so much for joining us, Keith, and good luck with the book and congratulations.
Hey, thank you guys. Seriously, thank you so much. Happy SABR Day to you all. And thanks again for having me. What a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. Take care. All right, that was terrific. God, that was so much fun. I learned a lot about Pete Rose, and I like Linda. You know, a lot of what I know is kind of negative, kind of all these things that are reasons I don't like him. But it was interesting to hear these other things, and I don't know about the rest of you, but it was also interesting hearing about how commissioners have dealt with scandal. You know, and Pete Rose being, you know, one of the biggest scandals in all of baseball, can't help but think that Rob Manfred is looking back at those things as he's had to deal with certain scandals, the Astros signs dealing in particular and others, and managing those things and trying to make them go away and being second guessed. And that's kind of where my mind went. You know, it was kind of off topic, but made me think about that. But any other quick reactions from anybody? Did you all enjoy this? I hope you did.
Absolutely, yes.
Great, yeah.
Yes. I got my Pete Rose ball.
Ah.
David, where did you get that signed? Did you get it personally signed or did you pick that up someplace?
I got it personally signed in 1980, no, 1994 or 95 in Arlington.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. Any other thoughts here on to the end of the meeting here, Jan?
Well, I just was going to mention that my wife grew up outside of Cincinnati during the Big Red Machine years, and she once ran into Pete Rose on the street, and he just asked her, "Can I help you?" And she was so flustered, she just said no and scooted off. And then we ran into him again on the streets of Cooperstown in 2013 when we were back there for the induction ceremony. He'd been signing autographs and had just quit. And my wife said something to him about, "Hey, Pete," just yelled, "Hey, Pete." And he said, "I'll be in Cincinnati in July. Like, come back later and I'll sign something for you for $20 or whatever he was charging at the time."
Yeah. Yeah.
So she's had a couple of in-person experiences with Pete Rose. Neither one turned out for the best.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrific. Well, this has been a lot of fun, folks. We've been on for about an hour, but a terrific presentation by Keith O'Brien. I've recorded this, so I'll stop the recording here shortly, and then what I'll do is I'll upload this to YouTube and then share it on our website in the follow-up for this month's meeting. Any questions or comments before we wrap up here? Side, you have anybody? Questions, comments?
Thank
Great
you for
program.
organizing this.
Yeah.
Oh
thanks,
yeah, of
Gilbert.
course. Oh, happy to do it. He reached out to a number of us on the leadership team, and we followed up. It kind of fell in our lap, but when you have new baseball books, and as a SABR member, he knows he's got audiences in all the chapters, and so we quickly jumped on it. And I think Jerry Miller responded and helped make this happen. So many thanks to Jerry for helping make this happen. And we don't have the March meeting scheduled yet, but with spring break and everything, there's lots going on in Austin, typically. But I'm just, I think we're probably due for an in-person meeting south, since we've been up north recently, and then we were in San Marcos, of course, last month. But maybe March 23rd, Saturday, March 23rd is what we're thinking, possibly, as our next meeting. But I'll check with our leadership team, and then we'll see. We might either do it the 23rd or the 24th, and then I'll send out I'll include it in the correspondence with the chapter. But if there isn't anything else,
Gilbert,
I
just something about Pete Rose. I happened to be looking at his minor league statistics yesterday.
Yeah.
And I think it was not the year before, it was 2 years before his rookie season. In some minor league, I think it was the Florida State League or something like that, he led the Florida State League with 30 triples. And nobody else had more than 12. And it's not like he played a lot more than anybody else. And these were all other full-time players. And he only had 17 doubles. So I was thinking, he must have really been hustling to turn those doubles into triples. It's got to be a very odd thing to have 30 triples and only 17 doubles.
Oh, that is. Well, it also speaks to his drive, perhaps. He wasn't settling for doubles. He wanted triples.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, thank you, Cy.
Gilbert,
Thanks, everybody.
I have a question.
Oh, please, David, go ahead.
We always point to Pete Rose for the poster boy of gambling. How big, how prevalent was gambling in baseball? Do we know?
Well,
good question.
Yeah, Keith might have been able to shed a little bit of light on that. I really don't know, David.
Okay.
I mean, since the Black Sox scandal, it's been a posted rule not to bet on baseball, right? It's been apparently a posted rule for many, many years. And that was the justification for why they came down so hard on Pete Rose, was that it was clear, it was off limits. Players were not to bet on baseball. And it sounded like they knew about his gambling habits well before the suspension. So I got to figure if there were players that were doing it, that was really on the down low, but really hard to say.
Okay.
Where do we get this book? Do you have a website or something? It's available from the usual
Yeah,
outlets?
it's in the usual places. But Linda, if you go back to the meeting announcement, there's a link to his website, and it's all over that. And then you could also just search on Amazon or other places, and then if you send him your receipt, he'll send you those bookmarks and a signed plate to add to your book.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Really need that book.
And the bookmark.
And
Keep
well, the
forever.
bookmarks. Yeah, the bookmarks.
They can just.
Oh yeah, I collect bookmarks. That's wonderful.
Hey, I hope you all have a great day. Thanks for joining us. We
All right.
extended our streak of meetings. So
Happy
Great
Sabr
meeting.
happy
Great
Labor Day,
meeting.
folks.
Bye.
Bye,
Take care.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Right.